We talked about My Favorite Husband as being the precursor, so to speak, of I Love Lucy.
Right.
Did you meet Lucille Ball and work with her on that show?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, we had the Isabel Scott Rorick book, My Favorite Husband. The original series was based on not I Love Lucy. I Love Lucy was not based on that. But, oh, sure, I worked with Lucy all the time. And even on the radio show, because I used to do promotion spots. The only promotion spots I did were not just with Bob Benchley. I mean, throughout my career, I was doing promotion spots and a lot of other things all along. And but I was in on all the contract negotiations for the original deal for I Love Lucy.
What was that like?
Well, it was fun. But it was a very interesting time because Lucille Ball had decided that her husband, Desi Arnaz, should not be on the road anymore with that band of his. And she was trying to figure out how to keep him home. And so I didn't say that right, but the fact was she wanted him to come off the road and be at home. And so she decided that if he was her husband on the television show, that would solve the whole problem. And after all, he was a band leader and he was qualified.
Was there resistance to that?
Was there resistance? I mean, it is only her perseverance that ever made the I Love Lucy show come to being, because she absolutely was not going to do it without Desi, period. And Mr. Paley and Harry Ackerman absolutely were not going to do it with Desi. They said that people would not understand his Cuban accent, and how could we possibly put on a primetime show where people couldn't understand what the people were saying? Many years later, we had a situation with Red Skelton where Red had one of his hernia operations and I just looked the other day at the tape, which I got from Mrs. Skelton, with Desi Arnaz and Marcel Marceau. And Desi comes on the show and he says, well, I don't know how we're going to do to substitute for Red Skelton. He says, you don't talk and nobody can understand me. So that's what Mr. Paley and Harry Ackerman were worried about. But, I mean, Lucille just stuck with it. I mean, I never saw anybody stick to her gun so much as she did. And they finally folded. I mean, it took a long time, but they folded, and you know, as you know, it became a very big hit, and I guess they could understand Desi well enough to get the jokes and everything.
The rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, the rest is certainly history in that case.
Well, was she the negotiator for the show, or did Desi pose as the business person, or?
You know what? If I recall, I dealt with an attorney for her. I'm quite sure that's the case. And I don't know how that name skips my mind, because I usually can remember who the attorneys were or who the agents were.
Oh, that's okay. I just was curious because later on, of course.
No, Desi kind of stayed out of the picture till this thing got solidified, if my recollection is correct, and I think it is. But then once it was set, you certainly did hear from Desi.
You did.
Yes, you did.
He was like the business spokesperson.
Yeah, I mean, he was very active, as she was. They were not just show stars who didn't pay attention to what was going on, and yet they had really marvelous creative people in Jess Oppenheimer and Madeline Pugh, now Madeline Pugh Davis, and Bob Carroll.
Mm-hmm.
But they were very much involved in the whole thing.
How about the selection of Vivian Vance and Bill Frawley? Were you there when that happened?
I was not in that creative meeting. No, I was not. But I believe that those were people that Lucy wanted.
And did you have much interaction with them once the show got started?
Oh, yeah, because I was administering their contracts until they went over to Desilu. Then when they bought the studio, and then they didn't produce it at CBS anymore, then I was not in the loop the way I had been previously.
Because they bought Desilu at that point.
That's right. They bought the old RKO studios and became Desilu.
Did Lucille Ball make the transition from radio to television easily?
Oh, well, yes, she did, because she'd been a contract player at RKO herself. I think it was kind of fun for her to buy the RKO studio, because she'd been under contract there as a starlet. I think I'm correct about that RKO was a studio to which she was under contract.
Yes, that's correct.
As a chorus girl originally, and then she developed into a lot more.
Let's talk about the early days of Studio City, of Television City, rather. That was like 1953 when that opened?
1952, TV City opened. In fact,
52.
Harmon and I, my husband Harmon, Oscar Nelson Jr., and I had a Lincoln V12, a 1938 Lincoln V12 that we bought from Phil Berg. Now, I didn't know at the time that Phil Berg had a little man who took care of keeping all the fluids in that car every day and so forth and so on. This car was a very big pain to maintain, and it's probably worth $150,000 today, but I sold it for $250 to the man who was ripping me off for parts. But before I sold it, one day I took Mr. Paley. He wanted to ride in my 1938 Lincoln V12 with the golf club door and the wheels that were covered, and the whippet on the front. So we went over to TV City. I took him to TV City when it was being built, and we went all around and had a jolly day.
Did it change the balance of power between New York and LA once the TV City was there?
Not quite at that time. About the time that I came back to TV in '59, it was starting to change. I mean, at that point, originally, most of the shows were out of New York. We had a few here, but a lot of the shows were in New York. And subsequently, the Hollywood talent pool, for a long time, as you may remember, the motion picture studios resisted allowing their contract players to be in television shows or even to go on our radio shows as guest stars. Once television started creeping in on them, they were sure television was going to kill motion pictures. And especially at MGM, I used to have the worst time trying to get Van Johnson, and the conditions under which we would get Van Johnson or Ann Miller or those people were very, very tough.
Can you tell us about some of those conditions, those demands they made?
They would demand, upfront credits for MGM and their latest picture and all kinds of stuff that was very difficult for us. We had sponsors and we had other considerations. And yes, we would always say at the end of the show that, Van Johnson appears to the courtesy of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Pictures, whose latest hit is. But they made it very, very difficult. And lots of times the credit thing for MGM killed the deal, and you didn't get the stars. But subsequently they began to realize, and now, I can't believe today how the motion picture and stars are just crossing over all the time and thinking nothing of it. If the money's good enough, they'll come.
I just read that Julia Roberts is going to produce a TV movie.
That's right. That's what I've heard.
Yeah. Incredible. Did you go to work right away at Television City, or did you stay in the radio studio?
I stayed in radio until 1959.
Mm-hmm.
And then as radio was diminishing, the guys decided that they ought to do something about putting me in television. So I was sort of foisted on Phil Feldman, who was then head of the Business Affairs Department at TV City. He really did not want somebody he had not selected, and he gave me a very bad time. The first show I worked on was The Lineup. The Lineup was an hour show out of San Francisco. It had had 5 producers in the first 3 shows, and this sounds like no money at all today, but at the time that I was given responsibility for the show, it was $200,000 over budget, and there seemed to be a little problem with certain people in San Francisco who wouldn't cooperate without payoffs, and there were all kinds of things going on, but we managed to get the thing under control, and I think...
How? What did you do?
Oh, I just kept beating on him. And I think that I earned Phil's respect. He gave me that show to put me down the drain, and it didn't. And ever after that, I had no problem with him once the Lineup got under control, or got sort of under control. It never really got quite under control.
When you got into television at Television City, did you have much contact with Mr. Paley?
I didn't have as much then, because by then things had expanded, and he didn't come out as often. When he did, why, it was for board meetings and things like that.
And he was more interested in programming, wasn't he?
That's right.
Than in the business side.
That's correct. Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Was he, in terms of his management style, would you say that he was good to his employees and always cognizant of employees' rights?
I wouldn't say he was cognizant of employees' rights. He was very interested in what was good for the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Gotcha.
And his selection of Dr. Frank Stanton as his, not counterpart, but as the president when he became the chairman, was one of the smartest things he ever did. And I think, although he never told me this, I think he may have regretted forcing Dr. Stanton to retire at 65, because Dr. Stanton was a computer brain, and Mr. Paley was this wonderful businessman, but his big forte was the creativity. He was a very creative man. He was also a very, very smart businessman. As I've told many people, Leslie Moonves is now at our company, and I'm thrilled because he reminds me very much of Mr. Paley. He has a lot of his style and class and charm and he supports his people. He's very loyal to his people. Leslie is.
Terrific. Tell me more, though, about Frank Stanton, because he was such a important person in our business. Was he a good manager and a good boss?
Oh, yes, he was. But we had very little, somehow we, in this area in California, had very little to do with Dr. Stanton. We did not have his rules imposed on us. He had very strict rules about offices and what they looked like and whether you could have family pictures in your offices and so forth. And he used to go in on Saturday mornings, I understand. I was not there personally, and go through the offices and check, who had inappropriate furniture or inappropriate pictures of their families on the desk, and those would disappear into drawers. And the Monday the people would come back to work, they would see some changes in their office. Now, we never had that at TV City. I have pictures of my children, my grandchildren, my husband, my mother, my father, my dog, everybody in my office, and nobody's ever complained.
How long have you been in that same office?
Let me think. I had a back office with no window that I shared with Frank Rohner at one point when we were both first in television. And but then Charlie Strauss, who was a director of business affairs and was also the brother of the man who owned thrifty drugstores, left the company to go be his brother's real estate advisor. Charlie must have left in about 1960 or 61. And he had windows all over his office looking out on Beverly Boulevard, and I am in Charlie Strauss's office, so I've been there, 38, 39 years, something like that.
Is that on the second floor?
It's on the mezzanine.
Mezzanine. Mm-hmm.
We say M is for money. We send money from the mezzanine. People are forever getting off on the mezzanine thinking they're in the lobby and don't know where they are.
And after all these years, do you get to use the executive dining room?
Oh, yes, I do. And I have, over the years, always had an anniversary party for myself. I take care of the invitations and the favors, and the company pays for the lunches. And I have about 20, 25 people every year for my anniversary party.
Lovely. I want to jump to 1950s when the blacklist kind of hung over our business. Did you have to get involved in that at all?
Yes, I did. And it was one of the toughest times in the business, and I'll be very interested to see what Betty Garrett has to say about it in her book, because her husband Larry Parks got caught in it, and I'm sure it was very detrimental to her family. My friend William N. Robeson was blacklisted. Took many years for him to get out of it.
What did he do in the business?
He was a producer director in radio and in television, and Ed Murrow hired him as a head of Radio Free Europe.
Did you have to sign a loyalty oath with CBS?
Oh yeah, I signed a loyalty oath. I did, but
how did you feel about doing that?
That didn't bother me because I was absolutely loyal to the to the country. So it was not a problem for me. It wasn't a principle that I shouldn't have had to do that. I was only stating something that was the truth, so it didn't bother me.
Where did those loyalty oaths go? Did somebody keep them in their drawer, or did they refer to them?
I've never asked that question, and I haven't a clue, but I'm sure they're in somebody's file somewhere.
Yeah. I just wondered if they were ever referred to at any point.
I do recall very distinctly that Elliot Lewis, who was one of our producers in radio and did some very good things in television. Actually, he was Frankie Remley, a left-handed guitar player on the Phil Harris show, among his television characters, but he was a very fine producer too. Elliot refused to sign it. And
what happened to him?
Finally, Mr. Paley waived it for Elliot.
Do you know of anyone else who refused to sign?
I don't know of anyone else that got a waiver. And of course, and I just didn't want to hear about who wouldn't sign, or, I mean, it was bad enough that the thing was going on, and I just didn't want to get any more involved in it than was necessary at the time.
Did the loyalty oaths come out of your department, though, or was that somewhere else?
No.
Oh,
that was all corporate.
That was. Okay.
There was a man in New York who was in charge of the loyalty oaths, whose name escapes me, probably intentionally.
Yes. How was your department affected, though, by the blacklist? I mean, did you have any problems there at all with the people you were working with?
No, not to my knowledge. No, we didn't lose anybody because of it and so forth.
What about negotiating contracts for talent? Were you ever in the middle of a negotiation and somebody was ruled out because their name was on the blacklist?
Yes, but I'd rather not get into the details.
Why?
I mean, it was a bad time, and it's
Yeah.
gone, and let's just...
I'm just for historical purposes.
No, I understand, but
Mhm.
I was involved in it more than I wished to be
What do you mean by
by the
that?
nature of my job.
Did you have to clear people
Yes.
with the red channels people? Or the people who put out red channels?
You had to clear assorted people, for various advertisers.
But you'd rather
I
not?
should say with.
Uh-huh.
No, and it was, handled in a rather, I wouldn't say surreptitious manner, but it wasn't very direct.
No.
So that's why I'd rather not get into it further.
Were there actors or writers that you knew that weren't hired? I mean, that you were friendly with from other shows that couldn't get work? Did any of them come to you to seek your help?
No, they didn't, because they knew that it was beyond the ken of what we were doing here. They knew it was corporate. Yes, I knew a lot of people that were affected by it. Some of my good friends. Some of it was true and some of it wasn't.
But they never had an opportunity to clear themselves.
Some of them finally did, but some of them didn't.
How long did that go on, do you recall? From the early 50s to what, like 54, 55?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
I really don't, and that's not selective memory. I really don't remember. It was a bad time, and we all wanted to forget it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a blemish on our whole
It was.
industry. In 1954, you became Director of Business Affairs in the radio division. How did that promotion come about for you?
Well, after they'd passed me over 3 times telling me I was a girl, I finally went to, I think it was Della Chapa I talked to. Yeah, he was then head of the program department. And I said, I love this company and I don't want to leave the company, but if you are not willing to do this for me, I mean, I know this job. I've been doing it for so long and I know I'm qualified. I think I'll have to leave and do something else, and I don't really want to leave. And I would like everybody to reconsider the fact that being a girl isn't the worst thing in the world, and I still can do my job. And they finally went to Paley and got the approval.
But they had to go to Paley
They
to
went
do
to
it.
Paley and got the approval.
Were there many people working in the division at that time?
In the radio division, we had a whole floor full of people, a whole 3rd floor. We had a lot of producers and directors and writers that were under contract. Cy Howard and Elliot Lewis and Frank Galen. I think that was before he died. Frank Galen was such a funny man. He did the Meet Millie show and many others, but he just kept us in hysterics all day long. And Elliot Lewis and William Robeson. I said Cy Howard, Mac Benoff. We had a big staff of people that were on staff at CBS that were creating shows.
And then what happened once television came in? Did they start drifting from radio to television?
A lot of the good radio people drifted into TV, but a lot of them still kept working in radio. I mean, for years I hired Jack Newman to write Yours Truly, Johnny Dollar, under a fictitious name, because he didn't want the guys that were paying him big bucks to write movies to know that he was writing Yours Truly, Johnny Dollar for me for $450 a pop.
He was a fantastic talent.
Jack wasn't the only one.
Yeah.
A lot of these guys that made it real big in movies after they left radio still loved the radio shows, and they came back and did it. And Jack died about a year ago, but it was very sad. But he was so funny about it. And
what name do you remember? What
wait a
name
minute.
I mean, it's not important, but I was just curious.
I'm trying to remember what Jack's name was.
That's okay. No, don't.
Bill Robeson used Christopher John. That was his fake name when he was under the blacklist. Jack had something that was the name of 2 of his kids.
I think he once told me, and I've forgotten myself what it was. Were you interested in getting back into television at this time, or you had done the Ed Wynn show. Now you were back in radio.
No, I could see that radio was starting to diminish on me, and so when they suggested that I move over to television again, I was delighted to do it.
Were there some of your contemporaries, people that you were working with in radio, that had already moved over?
Yes, there were.
But they were the men.
Ackerman was over there, and Della Chapa was over there, and I'm not sure at that time if John Reynolds was there. Howard Megan was there. Howard Megan, who presided over the building at TV City, actually Pereira and Luckman designed TV City, and they had their graduate students at USC School of Architecture design. It was the first television city, design their idea of a television city. And I remember Howard Megan having a meeting in Studio A at 6121 Sunset and introducing all of us to Pereira and Luckman, and then they had a huge exhibit in the lobby at 6121 Sunset of something like 40 different television cities.
Models.
Well, they were actually renderings that each of these kids had done. And I shouldn't say kids, they were graduate students in the architectural school. And from that, I guess they took the best of everything. And not too long before he died, which was just this year, Charles Kappelman, who's head of operations at TV City, and I got together and we invited Charles Luckman and his wife Harriet, who's a longtime friend of mine, and Jin Wong, who was then a junior architect at Charles Luckman's firm, who designed the addition to TV City Studios 36 and 46, which were added about 10 years ago. And we had lunch in the executive dining room, and then we took Chuck around on a tour of TV City. But he was fading even then, and he was in a wheelchair, and about halfway through the tour he got tired, so that's the last time I saw him.
I wanted to ask you if there was a big dedication ceremony for Television City, and were you were there?
Yes, there was, and I was not there because I wasn't in television at the time. But there was a big, Ralph Levy produced that show, and Jack Van Valkenburg came out, and everybody had a very busy time at that opening.
You mean they put it on the air?
Oh yeah, it was on the air. They had with all the CBS stars and Van Valkenburg in the front row with Lucy.
In 1955, Gunsmoke on radio was aired on CBS television. Were you there for that transition? Did you help in any of the negotiations?
I made the deals on the original radio show with John Meston and Walter Brown Newman, who wrote scripts, and all the others that wrote scripts. And I was in on a lot of negotiation with John Meston for his television contract, even though I wasn't in television. But he kept consulting with me about what he should do.
Kind of behind the scenes?
Kind of behind the scenes, yeah. But, I wanted him to do it because it was very important. The thing I always felt badly about was Bill Conrad was Matt Dillon in radio. And they tested and they tested and they tested, and they finally asked Bill Conrad to test, but out of courtesy, they should have asked him first, even if they knew they weren't going to use him.
But because he was such a big man,
yeah, he was very hefty.
Yeah.
And but John Wayne had suggested Jim Arness, who at that time was very famous for being a carrot from outer space in his previous movie. And but Arness did very well in that job.
Did CBS own the rights to the show?
Oh yeah, we owned all rights because John created it as an employee of CBS. I made the original deal with him.
Oh, did you work with Norman Macdonald then?
Oh sure.
Yeah. How about James Arness? Did you?
Oh sure.
Negotiate his deal?
Oh yeah. I mean his deal, which thanks to Dick St. John's and O'Melveny and Myers kept changing and changing. Went from Jim Arness to Arness and Company to the Arness Production Company, back to Jim Arness. I mean, it was all lots of maneuvering.
Well, the radio show had been on long enough, I suppose, that he felt that he had the power to ask for whatever he was asking.
Well, but he didn't get powerful till after 4 or 5 years of the television show. I mean, excuse me.
Yeah.
He didn't try to exert his power. And at one point, actually, nobody believes this, but I know this to be true because I bought the scripts. We had a 3-script series in which Jim Arness got killed. And I wanted to replace him with Peter Graves. This was before Mission Impossible. Of course, Peter Graves is Jim Arness's brother. But nobody thought that was a good idea. Nobody thought that they could work that out anyway. And I don't think to this day Jim believes that we really had those scripts, but Meston rewrote it so that Matt didn't die in the end when we finally got together with him on the deal.
You mean they were written so that if the deal couldn't be made, you would write him out?
Jim Arness would die, and we would replace him with somebody else, yes.
That's a maneuver.
And Hunt Stromberg did not think that was a good idea at all. I almost didn't survive for the suggestion.
And that maneuver's been used on other shows where stars were starting to make demands.
Yes, it has. But I think Gunsmoke was the first one, and John Meston wrote it, and he got paid quite fabulously for his scripts anyway. But he really got paid for those 3, and I can tell you, I know I made the deal.
When you say fabulously, can you name a figure for us?
Pardon?
Can you tell us how
I
much you
could,
made?
but I won't.
Okay. Now, Perry Mason, let's talk about that show, Raymond Burr. That went from radio to television also,
That's
as
correct.
Gunsmoke did.
Right.
How did that happen? How did it occur?
Perry Mason was already on the air by the time I got involved, and I mean, it had been on the air for quite a few years. But
Who produced that show?
Gail Patrick Jackson, who was
yes.
one of my best friends, we became very good friends, not only in business but personally. In fact, my daughter's first wedding reception was at her house when she was off to Europe. And unfortunately, Gail died of leukemia on my birthday in 1980. She was a great dame, and she was a very good producer.
She was quite a lady because I worked with her.
She was a lady.
That
she
was the first show assigned to me at CBS was
Right.
Raymond Burr. And I had a lot of respect for her.
Yes, indeed. And
Again,
that studio, that La Brea studio, which originally was Charlie Chaplin's studio, and then was where we did Perry Mason, and then subsequently we got it for Red, has had quite a history too, and then it became A&M Records, and now I understand it's been sold again.
I hadn't heard that. What kind of rights issues did CBS have to deal with when airing a non-CBS owned show? I mean, it was
Well,
a
Perry
Paisano.
Mason was based on Earl Stanley Gardner's books, which of course were a big hit before they ever went to television, and Earl Stanley Gardner was the creative guy, and Spencer Harrison, one of my bosses in New York, made that deal in the bar at Gail's house with Gail and Corny Jackson and Earl Stanley Gardner.
And was it a good deal for CBS? Do you
It
recall?
was a very good deal for Paisano. I mean, I am still sending money to Bud Vilde, who is Gail's widower, and lots of it. Perry Mason is in black and white, and it has generated, I believe, more income than any other single show. I think even these hot Friends and things like that are not going to generate the kind of money that has come out of Perry Mason.
Because it's playing all over the world?
It's all over the world, and it's in black and white. It's over and over and over and over.
And that doesn't stop people from
Doesn't
buying
stop. They have they are profit participants. As long as the show is profitable, their money just stacking up.
it. Tell us about Ben Brady, who was one of the producers on that show.
What do you want to know about him?
Just were your relationship with him good, or did you have problems working with him, or no?
Oh, he was okay.
Yeah, okay.
Gail ran the show.
Right.
The guys that said they ran the show didn't run the show.
What about Raymond Burr? Did you have a lot of contact with him?
Oh, I had a lot of contact with
Yeah.
him. I better not tell those 2 stories. I'll
No.
tell you after.
As soon as we change tapes, I'd love to hear those
Okay,
2
I'll
stories.
tell you these 2 stories. They're very
Okay.
funny.
Thank you.